Hey there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel. Thanks so much for dropping by. I also want to welcome all the new subscribers to the channel. Welcome aboard. I hope you enjoy the content and don't get scared away too soon. I'm going to be sharing with you today parts of my interview with Geoff Downes, and this is an interview that I thought had been lost. I was happy to find it, and I think you guys will enjoy it. And just for a refresher on who Geoff Downes is, in the late '70s he was in a band with Trevor Horn called the Buggles, and they had this hit "Video Killed a Radio Star." You may remember that one. Then he and Trevor went on to join Yes. They replaced John Anderson and Rick Wakeman, and that was an interesting time period. They made one album called Drama, went on tour, and then when that dissolved, Geoff Downes and Steve Howe of Yes went on to form Asia. And in 1982, their debut album was the biggest selling album of 1982. But that was 20 years ago, okay, as of the interview with Geoff, which was in 2001. A lot happened over the previous 20 years since they were basically ruling the world. 20 years later, Asia had released their 8th album, which was the tour that I was catching up with them on, and original members had come and gone over the years. By the time I meet up with Geoff, he's the only original member left. After John Wetton left, he replaced him with a guy named John Payne, who I also got to meet. And here's a photo of me with Geoff and John. Also, to get an idea of the success that Asia was having at this time, 20 years later, well, the record label, Recognition, which had just put out the new album, Aura, went bankrupt within the next year. And I was interviewing Geoff at an amusement park, Hershey Park in Pennsylvania. And so I'm walking through the park trying to find the stage area, where I can meet Geoff. And when I finally do meet Geoff, one of the first things that he says to me is, it's a bit like Spinal Tap, isn't it? And I was like, yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing. And the first thing I said to him was, I hope you got a bigger dressing room than the Puppets, which is a little bit of an inside joke. If you saw the movie Spinal Tap, there's a scene where they get booked at an amusement park, and they were not happy that the Puppets got first billing. Of course, the manager tells David St. Hubbins, well, you did get a big dressing room. And he was like, oh, great. Did we get a bigger dressing room than the Puppets? So anyway, Geoff and I had a good laugh about that, and we got down to the interview, and the Spinal Tap moments kept coming. Right out of the gate, I asked Geoff about the new album, the new Asia album, which had a bunch of different guests on it. And I asked him how the album got started, and this is what he said, and wait for the Spinal Tap moment.
We approached quite a number of people because we figured that some people we just physically couldn't get to do it. And I think it all started off really just a conversation that me and John had. And maybe close the door. We've got a roller coaster in the background.
I've never had that happen.
No. I don't think I have. So there's always a first for everything.
So yeah, one thing that, as you can hear, I didn't anticipate was the roller coaster going around every so often. And you're going to hear the roller coaster throughout the interview. It's going to come in, it's going to fade in and out. And if you really want to make this interview interesting, turn it into a drinking game, right? Whenever you hear the roller coaster, take a shot, take a hit, whatever you got to do. Maybe you'll really be into this thing by the time the interview is over. But fortunately, Asia got a better reception at the amusement park than Spinal Tap did back in the day. You may remember they didn't play to a very enthusiastic crowd. But I asked Geoff about the beginnings of Asia, in particular how, this is a supergroup. Asia was made up of Geoff Downes, Steve Howe, formerly of Yes, Carl Palmer, formerly of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and John Wetton, formerly of King Crimson and UK. In other words, bona fide prog rock bands. And so, the anticipation was that, wow, all these prog rock greats are coming together for this supergroup album. It's going to be prog rock heaven, right? Not so fast. When the album drops, it's more towards mainstream pop than it has anything to do with prog rock. And so I asked Geoff, how did it happen that the first Asia album was more mainstream pop than prog rock epics? What happened there?
I think it was something that obviously I'd come from a pop background. I was slightly different from the other three guys because the other three guys had played in big sort of icon bands in the 70s like King Crimson, ELP, Yes. I mean, I played in Yes briefly, but you know that was a different approach to the Yes that people knew in the 70s. And I think that we all felt that we wanted to do music that you know, acknowledged that stuff from the 70s, but also created our own sound that was ostensibly the four of us. And I think particularly myself and John Wetton were conscious that we did want to write songs and we wanted it to be very song orientated. I think the beauty of it was that with someone like Steve and Carl involved, they were pulling it away all the time from more of a progressive edge, pulling it in more of a progressive direction. So we ended up with, as you say, this kind of streamlined vehicle called Asia that was, I think, you know, in all intents and purposes, was pretty original when it came out. I think that we didn't just play old Yes songs and old ELP songs. You know, we tried to do something different.
The next thing that I asked Geoff was about the artwork, the album artwork. I always thought that the debut album artwork was just a badass. I always loved the album cover. I thought it was a really good Roger Dean cover. Now, Roger Dean is the guy that did the album covers for Yes during the 70s. So you got a prog rock artist, cover artist. And I asked Geoff, you know, since the band didn't go down the prog rock route, why did you get Roger Dean with the prog rock imagery to do the debut album cover? And I was reminded by the scene from the 40-Year-Old Virgin where he's got the framed Asia poster on his wall, and he's got this girl coming over that he's been wanting to go out with, and his friends are like, you can't have her come over here. It's like, you know, you have a framed Asia poster on your wall. Anyway, here's Geoff talking about Roger Dean and the debut album.
Yeah, I think that was through largely Steve. Steve had a very good personal relationship with Roger Dean because obviously Roger Dean had done, you know, Yes from virtually day one. So Steve was you know, very friendly with Roger, and I think we felt that Roger would encapsulate, instead of a retro kind of look like the old Yes logos were very 70s in their styling, that we were looking for this, you know, an 80s version of it, if you like, and I think he kind of achieved that. I mean, although it's obviously the same artist, I think that, you know, he made the effort to actually turn it into more of these singular images that were on the front of the sleeves, like the dragon, the Yeagle on Alpha, the robot on Astra. You know, that was very much that triangular logo, and then that single image were very much part of, I suppose, you know, to give it a kind of a mystique, because, you know, we weren't a pretty boy band. We wanted to speak really through our music and our images.
All right, so it's that time again. That's right, it's Asia trivia time again. And I want to ask you guys a question. How many official live albums has Asia released? All right, is it A, between 1 to 10, B, over 15, or C, over 30? Think about that. I'll give you the answer in just a few. All right, so up next, I asked Geoff about the songwriting process for their first album. Who wrote the songs? How did they come about? And in particular, how did Heat of the Moment come to be, which was their biggest hit?
Well, quite a lot of the stuff we formed in the rehearsal rooms. We actually rehearsed a lot for the first album before we actually went in the studio. I think we were in rehearsals for about 6 months because we didn't have a record deal at that point. And that was when, you know, during that course of time, David Geffen got involved and wanted to sign the group. Richard Branson wanted to sign the group to Virgin. So we had a couple of options, and I think we were working on quite a lot of. We were originally going to be a 5-piece, so we were auditioning people to expand the group to a 5-piece. And as time went by, it became more and more apparent that really John Wetton should be the singer, because he was, when we were just messing around doing stuff, he was just coming in with lines and singing it. And we started to get our own sound. So in the end, we decided that we'd actually keep it as a 4-piece, and John would take all the lead vocals. And quite a lot of the songs developed, and if you're looking at something like Heat of the Moment, that was one of the songs that John and myself actually wrote around the piano. So once we'd got some of the more group-orientated songs under our belt, like Time Again, Soul Survivor, we actually went round again, just me and John, and actually came up with songs like the chorus and verses to Wildest Dreams and Soul Survivor and Heat at the Moment, Only Time Will Tell. They were all done in quite a short period of time, and it was literally just me and him round a piano one afternoon, and he had a bit. In the case of Heat at the Moment, he had a chorus which was actually like a country song chorus, which was Heat at the Moment, and he sort of jangled it along with the acoustic guitar. And I had an idea for the verse part, so we literally just put the two things together, and then that was it.
So yeah, did you hear Geoff talk about the potential fifth member of Asia? That would have been interesting, especially if it had been Trevor Rabin, because Trevor Rabin was auditioning for Asia at this time, but he went on to join Yes, and of course they had really big success as a result of him joining the band. I don't think Trevor Rabin would have worked out in Asia anyway. He and Steve Howe would not have been able to share the same landscape as we got to know about 10 years later when Yes had their big union and all that, and Steve and Trevor did not get along. This interview, by the way, that I'm doing with Geoff is a year after the one that I did with Steve. And when I was talking to Steve about the transition between the first Asia album and the second Asia album, he talked about how he kind of felt alienated, like he wasn't part of the songwriting process. And I asked Geoff if that was a fair assessment, that Steve was isolated or maybe felt alienated after that first Asia album, and here's what he had to say.
Yeah,
What happened there?
I think that's fair to say, particularly on the second album. I think on the first album it was fairly, although the main tracks that were played on the radio were the Wetton Downes compositions, I think the record company on the second album started to push for me and John to write the album exclusively, because if they felt that, you know, they'd had Heat at the Moment, Only Time Will Tell, which were both hits here, they really saw, I suppose they saw us as the guys who were going to, you know, write some more of that, and that was going to be it. So a lot of pressure came on me and John to actually write the material, and I think what happened was that started to push Steve out of the frame, and Steve felt that he wasn't contributing in the writing side of it. And possibly that, you know, he has a point, because, and as I said earlier, in some respects the sound of the group relied on, you know, the pushing and pulling. Someone like Steve is quite a sideways thinker in terms of the music. So when we were writing the Alpha album, it was very kind of rock song, mainstream, verse chorus. It was quite formulated, and I think that maybe we suffered as a result of that it started to narrow the vision of the group a bit, and I think that, you know, that was even more manifest on Astra, and so the whole thing was going into a sort of a much narrower thing as time was going by. But, you know, having said that, I think that, you know, there's some good stuff on Alpha, and there's some good stuff on Astra.
So yeah, it was interesting how we talked about on the first album how, because the record label noticed that he and John Wetton wrote the hits, that the record label wanted them to write the whole next album, Alpha. And this is where Steve Howe was kind of left out, and why he resented that album and why the band started to fall apart. This is exactly what Steve Howe talked about when I interviewed him. He talked about how when the record label starts saying, oh, you are a songwriting team, you should write because you did this hit and this hit, so you should write another hit, that's when it's over with. And I totally agree. And really, Asia just kind of collapsed under its own weight, really, when you think about it. And I asked Geoff what the feeling was like within the band when Steve left, and then eventually when John Wetton left. Like, you know, as the original members started to go away, how did the remaining guys feel?
I think Palmer's okay with that. Wetton has a problem with it, I think, because he sees it as being something that shouldn't have gone on without him, even though, you know, as I remember in '91, he said that he didn't want to have anything to do with Asia anymore. So on that basis, I I kind of took it on further. And also, John and Steve really didn't get along for some reason as time went by, and I think that's at least that gave me the opportunity, because I'd kept in good contact with Steve. I'd done the GTR album with him. We'd worked pretty closely together over a period of time, and I think that it did enable me to get Steve to come back and do quite a lot of stuff on the Aqua album, which he did. And Carl was always, I think he saw Asia more as something to do whilst he wasn't doing anything else. And I think that if you look at people like Steve and Carl, their main bands have always been Yes and ELP respectively, and if the calling card comes from either of those two groups, they're back in there. Asia to them was really I think in hindsight was not really their baby as such, and I think that from my standpoint, Asia was a band that was really, I think, very suited to what I was doing.
All right, so as I said before, it's trivia time again with Asia, and this is the question. How many official live albums has Asia released? Is it between 1 to 10, over 15, or over 30? And the answer is C, over 30. That's right, and what has to be another Spinal Tap moment, Asia has over 30 live albums. As a matter of fact, I tried counting them for this video, and I think it was 37 or something. And the reason why I put 30 plus is because they just released Live Bootlegs Volume 1, which is counted as one title, but it's a 10 CD box. So I don't know, is that one title or is that 10 titles? It doesn't matter at this point, because a band like Asia having over 30 live albums is that's Spinal Tap. It kind of reminded me of the scene in Spinal Tap when David St. Hubbins is sitting there and he's kind of sad that Nigel walked out of the band, and he's like, how many people been in this band? 37 people been in this band. I mean, it's just hilarious stuff. And Asia just dropped a 10 CD live box. And actually, to my surprise, they just put out the Asia in Asia concert with Greg Lake. They remixed the audio and they just put that out. So add another one to the pile. I asked Geoff why the band had so many live albums. Have to keep in mind at this time in 2001, they had 8 live albums. So they had 8 studio albums and they had 8 live albums. Most of them had come about within the past few years. So I asked him why.
Well, I think the quality on some of them is definitely below standard. I think it really came about obviously the Moscow one, which was with Pat Thrall, John Wetton and myself. That was actually the first live album, and I think that was quite a nice thing for us to do. Was to be one of the first bands playing in the Olympic Stadium in Moscow when it all started to change over there, and that was quite an interest. So it was nice to actually document that. Other stuff, some of it, the official bootlegs, those 3 gigs were really something that people were selling them off on mail order, of which we don't benefit at all. So we actually have released them officially. We got the master recordings and released them officially. But I mean, they're literally just somebody's with a DAT machine or something like that. Right. So, that. As I say, the only reason we did that was because somebody else was making a profit out of our stuff and that we weren't seeing, so we actually chose to release them officially. But yeah, I mean, I think they're okay for people that like to have everything that a band does, but live albums are things that people tend to put out from time to time, but they're not a big statement. I think when you do a studio album, that is a statement.
All right, so up next, I talked to Geoff about his time in the Buggles. And one of the interesting things about the Buggles was that they were a true one-hit wonder. There's a lot of artists out there that get the one-hit wonder label, but if you really look at things closely, they had like a second minor hit can't count that. One hit wonder means that you just had one fucking hit, and that's the way it was with the Buggles. Video Killed a Radio Star was the only song that they're known for, and even that one only got as high as number 40 on the top 40 chart, so just barely got in there. And so the song came just a few years before MTV, before video really did do a number on the radio stars of the 70s. And so the song has always been seen as this like a prophetic vision of the future. So I asked Geoff what the song is all about.
It was actually based on, in fact I didn't write the lyrics, Trevor Horn wrote the lyrics. Trevor wrote the lyrics all himself. It was based loosely, I think, if I remember rightly, on a short story called The Sound Sweep by J.G. Ballard, which was about these people that used to go around recording studios hoovering up sound from the walls and the floor. I mean, a scientific, sci-fi kind of idea. And I think that's why Trevor turned this into just like this little prophetic poem almost. And it was more to do actually with the changing face of technology and how technology changes people's standpoint, rather than a specific statement, which did appear to be prophetic when it was actually shown on MTV. But in many ways that wasn't the idea about it. It was more of a global statement that like some of the lyrics in the songs were quite prophetic, like rewriting symphonies by machine, all these kind of things, all these ideas that Trevor had were very infectious ideas, and that's what translated into when we started to write the music for the song was, that's a wild idea, machines writing music. But of course, that specific thing does happen now. People write music on computers. People rewrite music on computers. You put something in and randomly comes out. And it was also really about the fact that we were approximately, he's a couple of years older than me, but when we were growing up in the 50s and 60s, the only music you could hear really was Radio Luxembourg tuning into like this old radiogram under your bed sheets or something, and you like twizzle the dial, you get to Radio Luxembourg, and there were these old sort of voices that used to come on there. And the idea was that these people you never saw, all you could hear was this voice coming through. And that was the idea, I heard you on the wireless back in '52, lying awake, intently tuning in on you. This was how Trevor saw that the whole thing. And I think really, as far as video, the actual title's concerned, I think that the idea was that video, which was just starting to break through then in the sort of mid to late 70s, would actually get rid of all these people on the radio that you've been listening to when you were, growing up. So that's roughly, how it's based.
What I find interesting is how these progressive rockers from the 70s, who were written off as like these big dinosaurs who were out of touch with music and everything, as we entered the video age of the early 80s, these prog rockers, they shined. I mean, they were the #1 bands. I mean, look what happened to Asia. #1 album of 1982. Look what happened to Yes. #1 hit single, Owner of a Lonely Heart. Look at Genesis. Look at Phil Collins as a solo artist, and Peter Gabriel. I mean, these bands were literally just blowing the lid off of MTV, the singles charts, the album charts. And so it really was interesting how the video age was very kind to a lot of these prog rockers from the 70s. I asked Geoff about Video Killed a Radio Star and how he felt about that video being the very first one played on MTV.
Well, I think it's only just come up. In fact, I went to the MTV 20 party a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's actually it's quite an honour in some ways that they did actually choose it. But it was 2 years later, and the song had actually been written the year before that. So, in fact, the song we wrote in 77, 78. So, as you can imagine, it was 5 years later. It's the first video on MTV. 4 years later, rather. At the time, you see, there was no big, because nobody knew what was going to happen to MTV. So at the time, it wasn't like, hey man, your song's just been, it was like you just heard from a couple of people, because MTV was in a very embryonic stage at that point. So it was only as time has gone by. In fact, there's more fuss made of it, much more fuss made of it now, because MTV's become such an institution than there was then, because at that time it was just like another cable TV show.
All right, so up next, I asked Geoff about his brief time in Yes, and you may remember I told you earlier how he and Trevor Horn of the Buggles, they replaced singer John Anderson and keyboardist Rick Wakeman in the band Yes in 1980. And a lot of times we talk about how difficult it must have been filling the shoes of John Anderson for Trevor Horn, especially when they went out and they played live. But how about Geoff Downes? How did he feel stepping into the shoes of Rick Wakeman?
Well, it didn't really come on me in that way, because we did quite a lot of stuff from the Tony Kaye period, from the Yes album and that sort of stuff, and Time in a Word. So it was split about 50-50, and then we were doing Parallels, which had Patrick Moraz on. So it wasn't really, I didn't really find it as daunting as I think. You know, John Anderson had always been the singer in Yes, and he had a certain sort of aura with people who came to see the shows, and I think that he found that it was an impossible quest for Trevor, really, to come in and take over in that respect. But as you say, the album itself, I think that we injected to Yes at that time. I think we injected a great deal of interest to the proceedings, because if you listen to their previous album, Tormato, you could tell really that the chemistry wasn't working right for them. The direction they were taking on Tormato wasn't leading anywhere. Yes had ceased to sort of continue developing. I think in that respect that what we did bring to Drama was really revitalising Yes in terms of their adding technology and that kind of thing to their sound, which made it interesting.
So it was interesting to hear Geoff talk about the Tormato album, which was the last Yes album before he and Trevor Horn joined. And that album I always had a problem with, never cared for that album. I did a video about my least favorite Yes albums, and I heard from a lot of you talking about how, you defend that album and think it's great. And look, everybody's got their own opinion. I think the album, in comparison to what came before it, it's very weak. And I didn't get the sense of a group. And it's no shock that the whole band fell apart after that. And I thought that the album that Geoff came in on with Trevor Horn, Drama, was a really strong album. I thought there was a lot of good stuff on it. It sounded like a band. It was interesting to hear Geoff's take on that album. I did ask Geoff if he thought that the whole project with Chris Squire and Alan White and Steve Howe would have been better received if it hadn't been called Yes, if there was ever any attempt to call it something else. And this is what he said.
I don't think so, because Chris and Steve and Alan were major owners in the name, so I don't think they felt they wanted to call it anything else. There was a bit of political manoeuvring going on, because Yes had already got a fairly substantial tour in the makings, and I think that cosmetically that had something to do with it, that that they had to fulfil that obligation. And having said that, it was a really good break, I think, for both me and Trevor. And I think that it made Trevor really. I think once we'd finished doing that, I think Trevor thought, well, that's it. I'm not going to do lead. I'm not going to be a lead singer. I'm going to be a record producer. Whereas for me, it was different, because I was a keyboard player, and you can't really get better than being the keyboard player in Yes in terms of an actual focus and of what you're doing. So it gave me a taste for live work and doing all that kind of thing. So it was good. I think it was good for both of us.
So yeah, Geoff raises a couple of interesting points, how the band was never going to be called anything else. It was always about furthering Yes, especially since they had a major tour that was already booked. And so they had to go out and play under the name Yes. And imagine you're a Yes fan and you're going to see Yes. Of course, this is before the internet. You have no idea that John Anderson's not in the band or Rick is not in the band. You go and you see the Buggles, Video Killed a Radio Star, merges with your favorite band, Yes. How did that go over? I'm very curious if you were a Yes fan back then and went to one of those shows and you didn't know that John wasn't in the band. What did you think? Would love to hear from someone who went to those shows. But as Geoff talked about, that was a very important time for him and Trevor. It really kind of set the stage for the rest of their careers. I mean, Geoff Downes, he got in front of a live audience. He got to work within a bona fide band. And then, of course, he met Steve Howe, which enabled him to form Asia. That meant a lot for Geoff. As for Trevor Horn, I did a whole video about Trevor Horn, which I will link to. He went on to produce 90125 for Yes, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, ABC, Seal, and so many other bands. And Trevor Horn is regarded as one of the best pop producers out there. And so it was really interesting how this brief moment in time just exploded both of their careers. Now, at this point, Geoff had only been in Yes briefly. He was only on one album. He was in the band for literally like 15 minutes. So I asked Geoff if he ever considered going back to Yes, if he thinks that rejoining Yes was something that could ever happen again. And this is what he said.
Well, I don't think so, really, because I think Asia, I've really, stayed with Asia for nearly 20 years now, and it's really been, I can't imagine me playing with any other band. And I really see the Yes thing as being a stepping stone more than anything else, because I think that go back in there again, it's only going to be as a retrospective look. I don't think I was in them for long enough for it to be, one album, when you look at their entire career, is a fairly, not insignificant, but it's only a small part of what's happened with them since. So from my own standpoint, I don't think I would do that. I might get up on stage and play a number with them or something, but I don't think much else. And I hear that John Anderson doesn't really consider the drama album as a Yes album anyway, so.
Well, isn't it funny what 10 years can bring, huh? Fast forward to 2011, and Geoff Downes was back in Yes, and he never thought he would have rejoined that band. It didn't seem likely, but isn't it funny how things change? You never know what's going to happen. Fast forward just 5 years after the interview that I had with him in 2001, and we saw the original lineup of Asia get back together again. Him along with Cole Palmer, Steve Howe, John Wetton. They recorded 3 studio albums. They did more work in 2006, 7, and 8 than they ever did in the original days, 1982 or so. And so they made up for lost time. And then 2011, Geoff reunited with Trevor Horn at the Trevor Horn tribute concert. As I told you before, he's a great producer. They put on a show for him, and he reunited with Geoff there. And Geoff also got to play with Yes, a very interesting version of Yes with Trevor Rabin and Steve Howe and Chris Squire and Alan White. So what does the future hold for Asia? Well, Geoff Downes is getting ready to go on tour with Carl Palmer in 2023 for a 40th anniversary tour. And, as far as I'm concerned, if you don't have any John Wetton or Steve Howe in the mix, then what's the point, really? It's kind of like another Spinal Tap moment. It's like, oh, Asia's going on tour? Who's in the band? Who's singing? It's comical. But one thing's for sure, they probably will be able to get another live album out of it. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this interview with Geoff Downes, what you thought about his time in Yes, 1980s drama album. How about the Buggles? How about that first Asia album? What did you think about the reunion albums that they did around 2006 or so? Let me know. And also be sure to check out the companion playlist to this video. It's like the soundtrack. I curated it just for you, filled with all kinds of music and video clips having to do with this video. All right, so I want you guys to stay tuned for more videos. I got some of those coming. All right, so until next time, I want you to take care of yourself. Don't take any shit from anybody, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. Hello, Hershey! Welcome to Asia's outdoor party. We'd like to play a song now, which is off the new album, Aura. This one's called Wherever You Are.